very grateful to the Kunstverein team, especially to Milan, who took the initiative, saying we should team up with the Hanne Darboven Foundation and the Kunstverein and use that very specific space for a symposium, but also later on for an ongoing cooperation between these two organizations, having contemporary artists using this space and other spaces for an exhibition. And as I said, I'm very, very grateful to Milan taking up that initiative and organizing that. So that's the whole Kunstverein team. My name is Christoph Seibt. I'm here today as the chairperson of the Hanne Darboven Foundation, but most of you know that I'm also active in the Kunstverein, as quite a number of people. I would like also to introduce you to 3-4 people who are very close to the Hanne Darboven Foundation and make that all possible. First is Esther. She just arrived. Esther Sarai and Wolfgang Betz. Could you wave your hand? These are my two colleagues in the executive board of the Hanne Darboven Foundation. Esther is a gallerist in Hamburg with a drawing room, and Wolfgang is a famous, world-known gardening architect in Hamburg, and having also an art collection himself. The next persons I would have loved to introduce you to Esther Döring. She is working on the catalogue Raisonné. She works with Spricht Magers. Unfortunately, she's ill, but it would have been quite an event for her also. We are very pleased to have Andreas here, Andreas Schleicher-Lange from Spricht Magers. We have started an exclusive cooperation with Spricht Magers, which is very fruitful and very friendly. So not the normal gallery, collector, foundation, estate type of relation. So Spricht Magers is very special. We are very thankful for that. And Spricht Magers is also helping us doing the catalogue Raisonné and helping us in administrative works. You are in one of the, I would say, numerous buildings which are owned by the Hanne Darboven Foundation. The Hanne Darboven Foundation was founded 2000 at a time where Hanne Darboven was still alive. You know, it's probably a short overview, but hopefully everybody knows a bit. She was born in 1941. By coincidence, not here at that place or in Hamburg, somewhere else, but in Munich. But still, I think she is a full-blown Hamburg-Harburg person. She lived most of the time here. She went to HFBK in Hamburg in 1962, got her art studies here in Hamburg, and she went over to New York in 1966. That was, of course, a very important time for her, meeting other artists of the minimal and conceptual art, and she had that relation since then, since '66. She went back to this place and she lived here on until her death in 2009. She died here in the building across the courtyard, and we will have the opportunity to go through the houses, to the atelier, atelier and living houses of her. This compound and the house we are in, that was the latest acquisition the foundation did in 2012. This house was originally built in 1910 by a Hamburg tradesperson called Brinkmann, and he sold that in 1935 to Cäsar Darboven. Cäsar Darboven was the father of Hanne Darboven. Cäsar was married to Kirsten, a Danish lovely woman, seems to be. Everybody loved Kirsten. And they had 3 daughters, and Hanne was the middle daughter, very close to her mother. They lived in this house since until 44, because the father had the Darboven Cafe business, and the factory in the harbor was bombed and destroyed. And he had sold this building, so the family building, just after the war to the city of Hamburg, and moved into the farmhouse just next to it. So this building was owned by the city of Hamburg and was used as a children's home, an orphanage place. And I do sort of quiz with two things. The first quiz is, how many children do you think lived in that house? Have a guess, Sasha. 20. Not bad. Another, you haven't seen the house, right? So it's 3 stories. 30, even better. Not that much, but 100. So 100 plus, like, I think 2 persons responsible for them. So I would guess 102 in this place. This was used, and if you see the film by Julia, she was saying, that's a children's home. Because at that time they were living across the street, that was across the courtyard, that was the children's home where all these children lived. The children moved out in the 70s, and it was used for so-called immigrants, German immigrants from Russia and other places, and was not used anymore in 2010. It was totally rotten, and the city tried to sell it, and the Hanne Darboven Foundation bought it. And we renovated it. It was very costly. It's planned to be a documentation center and to have symposium like today. So I'm very grateful that we had now our 3rd symposium. So it's not the first one, but it's the 3rd one, but it's the most important one, I can say. So thanks very, very much. So what else? So what we see on the compound is basically this old farmhouse, which was the family house for Kirsten. She was raised there, and all the family life started there. And then, because she worked, she put up every house and built up houses like this. For example, the Tower House was built in 1972, and it got filled up until her death. What we are seeing is basically the status as of her death in 2009. The second quiz question is, how old is the house, the farmhouse? Have a guess. You can't be wrong. 1650. I would say also not bad, but it's older. It's from 1497. So it's now 528 years old. So that comes with a number of problems for a foundation, but it's part of it, and it's part of the beauty. And the latest building, which was constructed and not by herself by hand, but like planned, is the magazine house there, where is a studio, but besides underground, there is the storage, climate storage of her works. So that's basically the building. That was the introduction, so you get an idea what we are doing. We are doing basically trying to organize exhibitions, helping academics in their works on her, together with Ruth Margers, as I said, greatly supported by them. And hopefully we are trying to organize academic events here and having exhibitions with contemporary artists now in conjunction with Kunstverein. Thank you again for coming, and hopefully we have a great day. And thanks to Milan.
Otis greift das Mikrofon. Hört man auf dem Stream? Yeah. Thank you, Christoph, for this really lovely introduction and for opening my eyes to this place. Also, I remember it was a cold winter morning when we came here the first time, and you already had big dreams of what this place could be, and I'm very excited for the journey and look forward to everything that is to come. We're here today to mark the beginning of a multifaceted long-term collaboration between the Kunstverein in Hamburg and the Hanne Darboven Stiftung. The symposium, Hanne Darboven's House, is a type of introduction, an initiation ritual, a moment to think and reflect about where we are, what the space offers, what it could mean as a place. Darboven's residence for most of her life was in the old farmhouse across the way from here. The family sold this house, as Christoph just pointed out, to raise money to restore their factories after the Second World War. It's interesting for a number of reasons, not least because it's fragile and elusive, rarely visited, and a testimony to the severity of Darboven's life and practice as a type of Kulturgeschichte of its own. When I'm asked what it's like, I usually reply, it's a version of the 20th century. To those that haven't had the chance to go, it's an extremely wide-ranging collection of objects that become oddly personal, displayed in what I can only describe as an extremely undomestic style, works of Darboven's and objects sprawling throughout the house, floors, walls, and ceilings. For anyone who would like to get a tour, we're trying to get as many people through today. Please get in touch with Martin Karcher. Because of the fragile nature of the house, we can only have about 3 people in at a time. There will also be other occasions next year, or you can get in touch with the Stiftung if you have a chance to visit on your own. Yes, there are many tours throughout the day. One key to understanding the progression of Darboven's collecting habits is her vest, which you see here to my right. Jörg Weil, her longtime assistant who's here today, told us on one of our many visits that once the jacket was full of brooches, it was considered completed. Darboven placed the vest on a mannequin, never to be worn again. It was decommissioned, its use value suppressed, and it was fossilized. By this logic, one room after another was filled, and once complete, Darboven would expand the building with an addition, new rooms for new epochs of her life. Perhaps the calendar, which I know that Sam will be speaking about shortly, which appears again and again in the house, serves as a careful reminder of the disjuncture between time as structure and time as experience, and the house becomes a material index of the intersection between Darboven's cosmology and lived experience, irreducible to individual parts. It proposes that information and materiality exist in a kind of unity and form a perpetual program. My suggestion here would be that we look towards how writing turns object, a kind of methodological transubstantiation, and how the house ultimately is a kind of material autofiction. The last building was begun towards the end of Hanne Darboven's life and sits to our left. And while she planned to continue, she would never have a chance to move in. With that being said, I'm very excited to introduce this afternoon's program. At 2 o'clock, Kirsty Bell will look at Hanne Darboven's house through the lens of Gaston Bachelard's, quote, "To write a room or read a house," and situate Darboven's house here in Rönneburg between the diaristic and what Darboven called the cosmopolitische global, while contextualizing the house amongst other artists' houses. At 3 o'clock, Elke Pippus, who worked with Hanne Darboven, will look at Darboven's work as the intersection of autofiction and a systematized way of thinking. At 4 o'clock, there's a coffee break. At 4:30, Sam Levitt will be today's last speaker and will look at the materialization of the temporal, the calendar, both as system and grid, taking the house as a type of compass to the cultural particularity of this region's cultural and colonial accumulation of wealth. At 7 o'clock, Matthias Taubel will cook asparagus with new potatoes, fresh peas, and a Cherville mousseline. And there will be a music program by Chess Club. At 10 o'clock tonight, Kumba Samba and Gretchen Lawrence, as New York, will play a concert before Chess Club rings out the night. Here my thanks goes to today's speakers, Paula Stoica, Kirsty Bell, Elke Pippus, Sam Levitt, as well as Sung Chue and Mathilde Gidaligidi, who won't be speaking today, but were part of the conversations leading us to where we are now. I would also like to thank Kumba Samba and Gretchen Lawrence, Chess Club and Amanda Weimner, the DJs who will be playing tonight, and Matthias Taubo. My thanks goes to the Hanne Darboven Stiftung, to Christoph Seibt in particular, and Jörg Weil for opening my eyes to this place. I'm also very grateful to Philips Auctioneers that have supported us generously, and here in particular to Tobias Siertel. Thank you, Tobias, for the support and for our many years of friendship. Our thanks also go to Donkey, who collaborated to make this day possible. Finally, I'd like to thank the team of the Kunstverein, Martin Karcher, Sarah Plochel, Linda Epp, Otis Douceur, Christian Becher, who's outside, and Robert Görs, who all worked tirelessly to make today public. Finally, I would like to introduce our first speaker of today, Paula Stoica. Paula Stoica is an assistant in the art history department at the University of Basel with Professor Dr. Markus Klammer since August 2022. Her dissertation project examines Hanne Darboven's artistic practice as aesthetic practice as a means of constituting the self within the context of a late capitalist society. In her lecture, Stoica examines the 1970s writing practice of Hanne Darboven as an intervention in existing hierarchies of knowledge. Departing from Darboven's statement, I am woman, Hanne, from 1970, writing woman into illegibility serves as a form of deconstruction that exposes the instability of gender and thus categorizes that organization, or better yet, produces our knowledge about the world. Stoica argues that Darboven's contradictions and conflicts effectively create a rupture in established knowledge, functioning as epistemic interventions and ultimately qualifying her writing practice as a subtle yet impactful political project developed in relation to both the 1970s patriarchal art world and the feminist efforts it sparked. Welcome, Paula.
I don't know, are we ready to start? Yeah, okay, great. Good morning from my side as well. Thank you, Milan, for the kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and share my latest research with you. My presentation today is based on an article that I recently wrote about Darboven, and I kind of had to condense my arguments, so yeah, I hope it's still easy to follow. So I'll dive right in. I am a woman writing Hanne. These words go back to a letter that the German conceptual artist Hanne Darboven sent to the American curator on February 26, 1973. The letter begins with Darboven's vague response to a postcard Lippard previously sent inquiring about her next visit to New York. Subsequently, Darboven addresses what appears to be a long-standing disagreement between the two correspondents, and I quote, "And Lucy, do what you do and want to do. I do so. Acknowledge the differing opinions between the two, indicating Darboven's respectful acceptance and even support of Lippard's. They also emphasize that the artist remains steadfast in her own views." Additionally, Darboven reminds Lippard that she already expressed her stance in a letter back in November 1972. After reaffirming her position by stating, and I quote, "Art is art, a man, a woman, a woman," Darboven concludes her letter with the emphatic words, "I am a woman writing Hanne." So only at this moment, it becomes clear that the letter focuses on the burgeoning feminist movement in the 1970s art scene, which Lippard was spearheading. So it is only at the end of the letter that we encounter the reason for Lippard's and Darboven's differing opinions. But more interestingly, Darboven's letter and its poignant closing words effectively position Darboven in relation to the feminist efforts in art in the US and in relation to the patriarchal structures that necessitated them in the first place. What's more, these words suggest that writing itself qualifies as Darboven's own mode of dealing or reacting to both the burgeoning feminist endeavors and the male-centered art world. I argue that these words, or more precisely, this statement, should be regarded as Darboven's own stance towards the polarized situation in these progressive circles at the beginning of the 1970s, which implicitly asked, or perhaps also explicitly, but asked women artists to take sides, either to join the boys' club and play by those rules, or engaged in the newly emerging feminist efforts. Through her writing practice, as I will demonstrate, Darboven chose to chart her own course while remaining in dialogue with a feminist agenda, contradicting the artist's disavowal that women's issues, as she calls them, were no concern of hers. In fact, this conversation between Lippard and Darboven appears to have emerged in the context of the preparations for Lippard's final number show, which featured Darboven along with 25 other women artists working in conceptual art at the beginning of the 1970s. Launched at the California Institute of the Arts, short CalArts, on May 14, 1973, entitled circa 7,500 after the population of Valencia, California, its inaugural location, this all-women traveling show was the first show to merge a feminist agenda with an experimental curatorial style, and holds therefore a significant position in the history of the politically inflected conceptual art. Moreover, Darboven's engagement with women's issues may have begun in 1972, but it has certainly not stopped then. It can be traced back in her correspondence, works, and particularly in her participation in feminist and women-only exhibitions, at least until 1999. That is, in at least 7 women-only or explicitly feminist exhibitions, such as What is Feminist Art, that took place in 1977 at the Women's Building in LA, which is a renowned feminist center in LA. And these encounters have been mostly overlooked by the research conducted on Darboven's work so far. But let's return to Darboven's closing words and ask the obvious question. Why should we give so much importance to a sentence that Darboven wrote to a friend in a letter in 1973, even though this friend was the feminist curator, Lucy Lippard. So first, we need to address the idiosyncratic status of the correspondence in Darboven's practice. And there are some strong indicators that the artist was interested in blurring the distinction between writing a letter and writing a piece of art, and thus between what can be regarded as the private and the public sphere. What's more, Darboven has not only published her correspondence with family, friends, and professional network, but also incorporated the same quotes from various literary works in both her correspondence and art practice. And we can also find similar visual strategies in her artistic practice or in her artistic work and correspondence alike. An example from the Busch-Reisinger Museum of Harvard University illustrates the letters in between status convincingly. The portfolio of 16 sheets, a gift from Sol Lewitt to the museum, displays a letter and the indices for a piece that Darboven worked on in 1974. All 16 sheets are framed, whereby no distinction is made between the letter and the indices, both of which are classified as ink drawings. And here you can see on the right-hand side, the first page, which intertwines conventions of letter writing, like the address, dear, dear soul, like the mentioning of the date and place where the letter was written, with a description of the work that Darboven was engaged with at that moment. And the page number 4, which you can see on the left hand side, shows the moment of transition between the letter and the indices. So while the decision to frame them, all these 16 sheets, as a cohesive body of work was most likely Lewitt's, it nonetheless demonstrates the letter's ability to serve as both art and correspondence, leaving the classification up to the recipient. Conversely, and perhaps more interestingly, Darboven chose to present her magnum opus, Schreibzeit, or writing time, as a piece of correspondence of sorts by addressing it to everyone. Also, Darboven included her name and home address, thus opening up the possibility of engaging in a dialogue with the recipients of her work. This gesture of explicitly addressing her thousands of pages of Schreibzeit to everyone draws attention to how writing letters functions as a way of constituting the self, or the I, an I, in the very act of presenting oneself to, and thus anticipating an interlocutor, a you. And indeed, writing letters has already been acknowledged and used as a technique of forming the self in Greco-Roman antiquity, as Michel Foucault demonstrated in 1984. So following this, with her statement, I am a woman writing Hanne, Darboven effectively presents herself and thus insists on being perceived as a woman writing within the context of the 1970s feminist struggles against the patriarchal art sphere. The asterisk above the word writing leads to an addition that Darboven included between the two columns of her 1973 letter to Lippard. This addition reads, "Did you not know this before? No explanation, no." So this sentence conveys Darboven's closing words an uncompromising tone, while also emphasizing that her position on the matter is represented by her writing practice alone. So if we agree that the words, "I am a woman writing Hanne," serve as a statement positioning Darboven in relation to both the feminist efforts in art and the male-centered art world, then we also need to acknowledge the consequences, because this statement introduces a new perspective on Darboven's writing, which impacts her writing based overall, and therefore requires a rereading. In this talk, I will stay within this initial context and explore the statement in relation to Lippard's women-only show circa 7,500 and the work Darboven initially meant to exhibit there. I want to begin by emphasizing the stakes of this statement by showing you the letter from 1972 that Darboven refers to in her later dispatch to Lippard, because this leaves little doubt about the importance of writing as a political strategy. And here you can see the letter in question, and I want to draw attention to a passage in which Darboven addresses the issue of gender, likely among the very first times, and links it to her writing practice. The passage reads, "Because I am a woman, I do fight for man. I don't have to fight for being a woman because I am a woman. I do fight for man. Art is a piece of work. Not every piece of work is art. But what else can art be than art? I don't fight no more, I write." So what makes this paragraph particularly noteworthy is that Darboven establishes here a nexus between art, the gender binary, which is the very framework of second-wave feminism, and her writing practice, while also underlying that her writing practice is linked to a fight she has given up in favor of writing. Darboven revisited this statement in her writings and interviews at least 5 times between 1972 and 1978, albeit dropping the reference to writing perhaps because it seemed to be obvious. These reiterations suggest that the artist believed her perspective on the matter was best expressed by this statement and its slightly modified versions. And I brought here an iteration from Schreibzeit, which is dedicated to Simone de Beauvoir. De Beauvoir is one of the many prominent figures Darboven turns to in her Schreibzeit transcription, and also one of the very first ones. And here the artist transcribes large parts of Ali Schwarzer's 1976 interview with Simone de Beauvoir, which was published in the Hamburg-based journal Der Spiegel. In this interview, entitled Das ewig weibliche ist eine Lüge, so the eternal feminine is a lie, the two feminists talk about the status of the women's liberation project, about marriage and motherhood, as well as about financial independence as a first step towards women's emancipation. Following this, Darboven comments on it with these lines. "I don't fight for being a woman because I am a woman, a human being. I do fight for being a human being because I am a woman. I do fight for men, human beings, men, because I am a woman, a human being. I don't fight for being a woman, etc." So Darboven adds human being to the terms woman and man, thus not only widening the scope of the argument, but more importantly, also revealing that the fight should aim at the more inclusive status, human being. And the fact that the argument is based on 3 circular statements strung together by repetition somehow leads to a confusion of the notions or of the categories woman, human being, and man. This confusion manifests itself in the structure of the argument. By parallelizing the 3 circular constructions, each initiated by the words "I don't fight" or "I do fight," and each revolving around the terms woman, man, and human being, Darboven inevitably suggests an equivalence and thus interchangeability between these categories. As a result, on the one hand, the categories of woman and man are rendered irrelevant by their very interchangeability, and on the other hand, interchangeability eliminates these categories in favor of the gender indifferent human being. And still, Darboven's emphasis that she's a woman seems to imply that there is a privileged, or that this is a privileged position in waging this fight. And I will return to this later. For now, I would like to go back to the passage. Oh, sorry, there's a minor issue with computer. Okay, I would like to go back to the passage. But what else can art be than art? Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm a bit confused. Okay, let's stay here. Yeah. I don't fight no more, I write. Because it further touches upon art's limitations to serve this fight, which leads Darboven to abandon fighting in favor of writing. In addition to raising doubts about whether Darboven considers her writing to be art, these lines pose questions about the political impulse linked to the fight under these circumstances. Has it vanished in Darboven's shift from fighting to writing, or has it been redirected in her writing, potentially as a more fitting means for waging this struggle? This necessitates first an exploration of Darboven's concept and practice of writing, and second, a consideration of the context in which this writing practice emerged. So let's start with Darboven's notion, practice of writing, and return for a moment to the statement, I am a woman writing Hanne, because I believe that it helps clarify Darboven's idea of writing. And if we look at the verb writing, we notice that it is in the present continuous tense, introducing some significant implications. To begin with, it showcases Darboven's view of writing as a continuous pursuit. Writing is presented as an ongoing process rather than a means to an end, such as writing poetry or writing a conceptual work. This understanding of writing as a perpetual activity, not directed towards a specific product, corresponds to Roland Barthes' notion of writing as an intransitive verb. The writer is, according to Barthes, and I quote, the one who writes, absolutely. And Darboven's monumental writing-based oeuvre stands testimony to her commitment to this concept of writing, whereby the single works function as, and I quote Elke Bipus, momentary figurations. But her letter is itself a manifestation of this concept of writing. On the second page, so on page 2, we encounter a form of asemic writing. That is writing that doesn't transport a message but underlines its graphiological dimension. This form of writing shifts the focus from writing as a means of communication to writing as an activity. The focus lies here on the interplay between corporeality, the writing instrument, the employed writing technique, or perhaps more accurately, the pattern, and the paper, whereby a more complex concept of writing emerges, one that transcends the idea of writing as merely a means for transmitting information, which corresponds to the so-called scene of writing, or Schreibszene, introduced by Rüdiger Kampe in 1991. And this has its particular or peculiar manifestation in the strategy of coping out as we encounter it in Schreibzeit. Now, if we return to the statement, I am a woman writing Hanne, where Darboven explicitly embraces this gender identity and establishes a strong connection to writing, the main question is, how do writing and gender relate to each other, right? And the first possibility is to consider Darboven's statement as a simple description, right? The artist is a woman named Hanne who writes. The structure of the sentence suggests that the category woman acts as a reference in the writing process, implying an ongoing engagement with it. In other words, it seems that woman serves as a permanent reference in relation to which the writing takes shape. And this raises questions about the impact of writing on the concept of woman, and conversely about how writing is shaped when conducted from this gendered position. But the sentence features a performative dimension as well. It is with the writing itself that this gender identity is attributed to the I, to the subject of the sentence. This constitutive act appeals to the performative aspect in language and, most importantly, presents the writing act as the construction of the artist's subject as a woman within the act of writing. So, I am a woman writing Hanne institutes these words within the writing process. And against this background, the I, the subject, is simultaneously created in or within the activity of writing, created as a woman who writes. The performative instantiation thus presents the writing act as the constitutive force that establishes the subject, a gendered one, within writing. Let's turn now to the context in which the statement, I am a woman writing Hanne, emerged, and situate these words in relation to Lippard's show circa 7,500. A few words on Lippard's traveling exhibition. Circa 7,500 converged conceptual art and feminist impulses, albeit without being explicitly framed as a feminist show. And it traveled from Cal Arts in Valencia, California, to 9 other locations, including London, UK. The exhibit highlighted that, contrary to popular opinion, there were many female conceptual artists, while also indicating that conceptual art was especially appealing to young women artists, enabling them to establish themselves as artists more easily. And as Catherine Morris argues by drawing a parallel to video art, conceptual art was a largely experimental and thus heterogeneous and dynamic field, not yet canonized and institutionalized. It possessed no particular market value since it emphasized unsophisticated and cheap materials, and more importantly, art historians and critics have not yet intervened and excluded the contributions of women artists in their discussions of conceptual art. And I will further argue that the systematic nature of conceptual art was essential for women artists to acquire knowledge about themselves and their position within a patriarchal society, while also serving as an instrument in constituting new subjectivities. Of course, this is mirrored in the diverse subject matter and material introduced by female conceptual positions featured in the show, like Lederman Ukulele's maintenance art or Martha Wilson's cataloging of breast shapes. And here you can see some exhibition shots which perfectly captured the bureaucratic character of conceptual art at its very best. So, despite her assurance that women's issues were no concern of hers, Darboven was among the 26 women featured in this traveling exhibition. Interestingly, however, my intention to track down and closely examine Darboven's work featured in this show were met with significant obstacles. Neither the exhibition shots nor the exhibition catalog or any other documents in Lucy Lippard's papers at the Archives of American Art provide any clues apart from indicating that the work in question was a book titled 1969 00 arrow 00. So, however, no book with this title is listed in the catalog of Darboven's books, nor does the estate have any record of this book. So I had to choose a different path. And luckily, I found in Lucy Lippard's papers in Washington evidence that Darboven intended to submit a different work to Lippard's show. one that appeared in the 1972 spring issue of Avalanche magazine, published in New York by Lisa Baer and Willoughby Sharp. But because the magazine had lost parts of this work, Darboven had to improvise and send in the aforementioned book, 1969-00. Right, so you can read the passage. It says, Hanne Darboven's delay was unavoidable as she was here, and we were sending a piece that was also in New York, but it turned out the Avalanche, which had lost part of it. Charming. So her new work had to wait till she got back to Hamburg, which was just now. What I also found in Lippard's paper is a draft of her curatorial statement for circa 7,500, in which Lippard made a remarkable observation about Darboven's work that, interestingly, wasn't included in the final version. Lippard notes that the works of Darboven and Christine Kozlov are, and I quote, most systematic and unattributable to any sexual origin. The fact that Lippard discusses Darboven and Kozlov with respect to gender and retracts this observation in her final version is telling. One reason that comes to mind to explain this omission is that Lippard may have felt her argument regarding potential differences in women's and men's art was compromised. While emphasizing that, and I quote Lippard, art has no sex, but artists do, Lippard indicates that gender-based differences in art production arise from a society built on the gender binary and the oppressive and discriminatory value system associated with it. This inevitably leads to distinct experiences for female and male artists, which in turn impact their work. And yet, Lippard's observation on Darboven's work and on Kozlov's work raises a valid point that complicates my considerations regarding writing as a way of establishing a gendered subject, but also introduces a productive angle. Lippard is certainly right to say that Darboven's work eludes the mark of gender and thereby points to a rather consequential contradiction between Darboven's self-constitution within her writing as a woman writing and the simultaneous resistance of her writing pieces to being identified as a woman's work. And a closer look at the project Darboven originally intended for circa 7,500 exemplifies this convincingly. The piece, most likely an excerpt from a larger work, was printed under the title Hanne Darboven Words, without providing any contextualization. The first section covers ranges of written numerals from 1 to 44, 1 to 45, 1 to 46, up to 1 to 52. The second starts with 1 to 44 and concludes with 1 to 53. The third begins with writing out 1 to 45 and finishes with 1 to 54. The fourth starts with 1 to 46 and ends with 1 to 55, while the fifth and final section opens with 1 to 45 and ends abruptly afterward mid-counting. The sudden cut irritates and creates the impression of a contingent selection. Furthermore, based solely of this excerpt, one cannot grasp the underlying logic of the piece or its idea. So it leaves us also in the dark about how the work might continue. And of course, as a typewritten document, it removes the personal touch and its accompanying sensuous quality, adding to the work's overall austerity and prompting the reader to concentrate on the idea. However, since it is nearly impossible to identify the idea from the given fragment, the reader is left solely with the typewritten numerals, presumably a glimpse into a larger work that remains inaccessible. Similarly, what lies beyond reach is the artist subject, as marks of subjectivity, let alone gender, are eliminated. Gender is not discernible in the work, as there are no gender markers on the formal or stylistic level to indicate a woman's presence behind the typewriter, nor does the content address gender. So solely the description of the work to Hanne Darboven, that is the work's authorship, reveals that we are dealing with a woman's work. Lippard is thus correct in suggesting a connection between the strong systematization and the gender neutrality presented in Darboven's work. Also, in the example discussed here, the typewriter contributes greatly to eliminating the subjective and thereby gender codes. By leaving the recipient alone with their own set of expectations, the work employs opacity or strategies of withdrawal. And by doing so, it draws attention to the categories and the accompanying value system that underpins every act of reception, and more importantly, to their limits. And what remains is a strong sense of frustration. So while the elimination of subjectivity resonates with the male-centered artistic strategy prevalent in conceptual art at that time, the neutrality in Darboven's work cannot be regarded as a mere adoption of that norm. On the contrary, it appears to be a conscious employed critical operation that rests on a contradiction. Darboven explicitly constitutes herself within the act of writing as a woman who writes, while her writing bluntly disregards any subjective component and any classification as woman's work. So despite the fact that we are encouraged to regard Darboven's writing as a woman's work, the writing itself undermines this interpretation by strongly emphasizing its self-referentiality. Thus, it rejects not only the classification as woman's work, but also any categorization beyond that of typewritten numerals arranged according to an unspecified pattern. However, one could argue that Darboven's practice might invoke the already heavily feminized administrative labor in the 1970s. Consequently, gender would be already somehow embedded in Darboven's practice of computing, typewriting, and filing, and thus in clerical work largely performed by women in the 1970s, as it is perhaps even today the case. Hence, the contradiction would ultimately prove to be no contradiction, and gender would be addressed at the level of clerical practices and their classifications as women's work within the 1970s field of work. And yet, unlike artists such as Adrian Piper, Rosemary Castoro, or Howardina Pindell, who, in addition to working as clerks to support themselves, explicitly draw on their experiences as pink-collar workers, as Anna Lovat calls it, and incorporate instruments, materials, and techniques associated with clerical work in their artistic practices, Darboven is not particularly interested in making this form of gender labor visible in her practice. In fact, Bridget Doherty convincingly argues that Darboven's focus lies elsewhere. So although specifically addressing clerical work by confronting a life-sized armless mannequin, a stenographer, with the remarkable achievements of Marie Curie, Rosa Luxemburg, Gertrude Stein, and Virginia Woolf in Quartet 88, Darboven identifies with these remarkable women who have impacted their fields rather than with the women entering the workforce as clerks at the turn of the 20th century. So this is, of course, further supported by Darboven explicitly stating that she developed the foundational principle of her mathematical prose, which is 1 is 1 is 1, and 1 ist 1 ist 1, in response to Gertrude Stein's famous line, "Rose is a rose is a rose." So, without denying the reality of the workforce and the strong feminization of clerical work and its materials in the 1970s, because Darboven herself began in the 1970s collaborating with a professional typist who executed her typewritten works. And if this is the case with the avalanche piece, it would further support and complicate my argument, of course. But nonetheless, I'd like to explore a different possibility, and this presents itself when we approach the contradictions and conflicts in Darboven's writing at face value. And this will enable us to consider them as critical operations with significant epistemological and political implications. And this leads us to the final point of my presentation, which I've dubbed On Writing Woman and its Epistemological Implications. So, as I've shown, Darboven's writing creates a tension that might be the crux here, precisely because it establishes qua writing Hanne as a woman writing, while at the same time refusing to sustain it. So its very position between writing and unwriting woman qualifies it as a form of deconstruction supported by Darboven's continuous non-representational writing. And it is within this dynamic that writing woman initiates its unwriting as writing into illegibility that is beyond recognition. And to push it even further, writing woman introduces its unwriting and institutes the possibility of an otherwise writing. And by doing so, Darboven resonates with, or perhaps implements, what Judith Butler has stipulated about gender as both, and I quote Butler, the mechanism by which notions of masculine and feminine are produced and naturalized, as well as the apparatus by which such terms are deconstructed and denaturalized. So gender itself can act as the very possibility of its deconstruction and denaturalization. And this, of course, carries considerable epistemological implications, since it shows how unreliable categories and norms are, which are fundamental in providing, or perhaps better, constituting knowledge about the world. And as evidenced by the work that Darboven originally had in mind for Lippard's show, these tensions created within writing significantly impact the reception too, by frustrating labels such as woman's work and expectation, thereby shedding light on the limits and instabilities of categories, be it art, woman, man, and of course the accompanying value system that guides the act of reception. The significance and reach of the discussed paradoxes in Darboven's writing come into sharper relief when we consider Teresa de Laureti's argument that art itself is a technology of gender, which means that, among other technologies, art too is involved in constructing gender by presenting representations of gender. So the author makes the following more general yet powerful statement, and I quote, "In the simplest sense, it can be said that all of Western art and high culture is the engraving of the history of that construction." So, of the construction of gender. So this poignant assessment of Western art and high culture made by de Lauretiis renders significant the position from where Darboven initiated the unwriting woman in her writing practice. So situated at the intersection between feminist initiatives and conceptual art, and therefore opposed to or at the margins of the mainstream art world, still largely operating within the framework of a traditional and indeed male-centered notion of art, Darboven's self-representation as a woman writing appears inevitably in sharp contrast to the predominantly male representations and constructions of gender prevalent throughout the artistic production in the West. So Darboven's positionality exposes Western and high art as a technology of gender and gender ideology. And what's more, and this is crucial in my view, Darboven's writing doesn't present a counter-representation of what woman is within her writing, therefore refusing to engage in the construction/representation of gender. Her indifference toward putting the record straight initiates a rupture that remains palpable. And to echo what Judith Butler expressed in a slightly different context, which underlines the significance of such interventions even more, and I quote, "Disrupting what has become settled knowledge and knowable reality is intervening in the nature of transformation." So following Butler, if social transformation starts with a rupture in the realm of established knowledge, which also defines what we perceive as reality, then Darboven's act of writing woman into illegibility can clearly be regarded as her own political, perhaps even feminist, project aimed at challenging categories and norms that create and validate this knowledge. So, against this background, writing is indeed a very productive mode of fighting. Thank you.
For this very insightful presentation. We now have the opportunity for asking some questions. I know it might seem a little bit too much with the microphone, but since we're streaming the event, I will have to ask you to speak into the microphone when you ask a question. Are there any questions in the audience? Sure.
Thank you, Paula, for this wonderful lecture. I'm curious because I know you've been here in the past also in relationship to the house. The mannequin figures quite often, sometimes as a kind of anonymous figure of the woman, maybe wearing a uniform, maybe wearing other forms of clothes. Marilyn Monroe is also there. There are not that many, and I'm now sort of quoting from memory, but not that many male figures within. Picasso appears,
Yeah.
Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah. They are the joggers in Kulturgeschichte.
Yes, but within the house, could you maybe speak a little bit to the kind of veering between the anonymous female figure and then these kind of highly charged symbols or icons of the 20th century?
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's a wonderful question. It doesn't touch upon my focus of the current presentation, but you're right. There is a strong gap between these anonymous women and these highly popular male figures. But the question is, I think from my point of view, the most interesting question is how Darboven acts with this, or what does she do with these figures? And another aspect which is interesting, I think, the strong contradiction between, as I said before, these stereotypical depictions of women, like the stenographer. We have Marilyn Monroe, who of course is very popular, but I mean, she's so popular that she's like acting like some kind of sign, like an icon, right? So yeah, I don't know, I need to think about this more also in conjunction with her writing practice, because this kind of accompanies her writing practice, but of course dealing with or including found materials, which these figures are, right, adds another layer. And these are figures which were in the circuit of pop culture, right, and also in the circuit of there were figures which were bought and sold, right? She bought them somewhere. I don't know, this is just like a path which could be productive. But from my point of view, I was, like you heard, more interested in the writing act. But yeah, thank you for the question. I'll have to think about this.
Hallihallo, thank you for sharing your research and ideas. And I I'm a huge fan of Hanne Darboven, really super happy to be here. But in fear of sounding banal, I never really read her writing of her name. And when I saw at the bottom, you know, when you said Hanne, of course, at first I thought Hanne, but Hanne, actually, perhaps her whole work is a manifestation of a repeated pattern of her name, because the way she writes Hanne, as a German speaker, first language, I couldn't actually read it. So, you know, you've really kind of brought about a totally different idea on Hanne Darboven in my head, because all of a sudden the feminine is subversively reintroduced in the deeply banal repetition, potentially.
I mean, that's an interesting observation, and I agree with this. Repetition, of course, is the basis, right, of her artistic practice. Yeah, and I could see a connection there also to Gertrude Stein with her tautologies and repetitions. You know, that's a strategy of questioning, or yeah, it's also it works. It functions like a critical operation in her works, which also coincidentally makes them unreadable. So Gertrude Stein is famous for her unreadable works. So I mean, that's I think that's a keen observation. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Paula, for this wonderful and precise insight in Darboven's unwriting a woman. My question is, would you say this focus and explicitly positioning in this topic of gender is more focused on the 70s, or would you go, it comes again in the later world?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, all the material I've shown is comes from the 70s, right? And I mean, that was also the high phase of second wave feminism. So I guess it makes sense to put like to look into this particular period first, and maybe draw parallels to the later to her later work. But I mean, also her writing changes, right, over time. Yeah, I don't know. So for me, it was like when I stumbled across this sentence, I was fascinated, and I wanted to explore this potential which lies within this this statement, and it was like a rabbit hole, you know. And here I am, and I was a bit skeptical at first, because Darboven isn't a figure who is associated to the feminist, to the second wave feminism. But if you look at all the material, and again, the material comes from the 70s, it's there, but there, I mean, I think it still has an importance, or it is important for her, mainly because she continues to participate in women-only and feminist shows until 1999. And I mean, you told me the wonderful anecdote that you organized the exhibition. You need to remind me of the title, Rahmen Netzwerke. And it was an exhibition focused on women artists, right? And Darboven was kind enough to give you a work of hers for this exhibition, and incidentally, this work was Webstuhlarbeit. So I mean, there is something. I don't want to pinpoint it to say, okay, this is relevant only for the 70s. And I mean, the 80s are a more conservative decade. Maybe that is also a relevant factor. I don't know. I'll have to think about it, because this is really what I scratched on the surface, like the first layer, and I have to see what comes next. Thank you for the question.
If there are no more questions, then we'll be going on a break until 2 o'clock. Paula, thank you
Thank
once
you.
again very much.
Thank you.